Well, a lot to discuss. Let's greet our panel right now. From Rio de Janeiro, Maria Paula Carvalho is a journalist and author of the book Brazil, the Reconstruction. Here with us in the studio, we have Roberta Braga, Assistant Director of the Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council. Also, Otaviano Canuto, an Executive Director at the World Bank and the Director of Strategy at Arko Advice, Thiago de Aragao. Welcome to all of you. Otaviano, let's start right here in the studio. The IMF held their spring meeting last week, very upbeat about Brazil. It said that it would revise its forecasts upward for Brazil's economic growth. Do you believe Brazil is now firmly on the path back to growth?
In the short term, clearly that's the case. The economy is poised to grow something close to 3% this year. But as pointed out in the previous comments, the fact is that the full recovery will come once investments are up the ground. And that will be facing some uncertainty until at least the elections come. The bottom line is that the more positive are the signals coming from candidates, leading candidates, with respect to solving the fiscal quandaries, with respect to implementing structural reforms on the pension systems next year and so on, the better that will be with respect to the investors. Of course, there are some other investors, and that includes the Chinese investments, who are looking more to a longer term and which have seized the opportunity to start looking for opportunities to invest in Brazil. So all in all, as long as there is no let's say, negative signals coming from incoming candidates, things look poised to full recovery in the following years.
So, Otaviano, to see sustained growth, you'd have to have political stability in Brazil in the coming months?
I would say one has to have signals coming from candidates that they would pursue the fiscal reforms that are necessary to put the Brazilian economy on track, which includes the pension reform. Of course, an election period is not, in a democracy, not the typical way, the typical moment in which candidates talk about the pain that will be necessary. But to some extent, what investors can read is the subtle messages coming from those leading candidates.
Okay, let's go to Rio and say hello to Maria Paula. Maria Paula, welcome to the show. I just want to take a step back here. You know, we've been talking about Brazil being in a recession for the last 2 years, and I'm wondering what got the country into a recession in the first place? Was it commodity prices that went down? Was it political instability? Was it a lack of investment? Was it a combination of all of that? What's your take on that?
Well, I would say a bit of all of this. One should remember that in 2001, there was this perception that Brazil would be one of the biggest economies in the world. We became the B of the BRICS. We started fighting poverty and inequality. There was this massive gas and oil discoveries. So everything believed in Brazil. But the contrast over 2 decades was striking. We had this recession in 2015. And it repeated in 2016, numbers that were just compared with the Great Depression of 1929. And the unemployment rate grew steadily. And so what we think today, will we recover again? So Brazilians are tired of this expectation and disillusion. Today it's clearly that the government didn't take advantage of the golden years of the international trade to create conditions for a sustainable growth. It actually incentivized consumption instead of a balanced budget and domestic savings. And of course, political instability was another problem. But if it's true that corruption, for example, can cast a shadow on Brazil's growth, it's also true that the country has now an opportunity to change its way and its image, both of which are important for progress. So we can say that the convictions rendered in the emblematic cases, as the Petrobras bribery scandal, which is in the center of the car wash investigation, can show that Brazil is on track for better governance. So let's wait and see for the results of that.
Thiago, what's your view on that? When we look at these core causes of what led to the recession in the first place, things like corruption, things like political instability, lack of investment, have those core causes been overcome now?
No, they are being slowly overcome, but in slices, and hardly they will be ever overcome, at least in the short or middle term, because corruption is a problem in Brazil that hasn't begun with the previous administration. This is a historical problem in Brazil. This is a cultural problem in Brazil and a social problem in Brazil. And the solution for that is something that will take a long time for us to see corruption being considered solved in Brazil. At the same time, the lack of the capability of planning and understanding and preparing for the future is something that it's still not fully embedded in our administrations, neither in the state level, neither in municipal level, and even less in the federal level. So I think we're still going to need a time to see those changes. But most important than that, the relationship between society and candidates is a relationship that only now is beginning to demand transparency and beginning to demand planning, which is not a characteristic in the relationship between voters and candidates.
How much credit should go to President Michel Temer? He's not a popular president in Brazil. He took over after the former president, Dilma Rousseff, was impeached. But should he get credit for the recovery?
He should get some credit, absolutely, because first of all, we cannot mix the buckets of problems and issues. If there is a bucket of a major problem between individuals very close to the president that has been accused of corruption and are being investigated and will be fully investigated after that, after the period in the administration, this is one thing, this is a major problem, and this is a sign that Brazil still has to work a lot on transparency. However, if we move to a second bucket, we can find some attempts for the approval of the pension reform, for example, that even if it hadn't succeeded, it was placed as a major discussion item during the year, increasing the knowledge of the society and the congressmen towards the issue. And apart from that, other things were also approved, which gives more fiscal equilibrium to the administration and also had a direct link and support for the economic recovery that we're seeing. So depending on the angle that we evaluate, the government should receive some praise in some angles, and it should be criticized in others.
Roberta, Brazil is the largest country in Latin America. It also has the largest economy. How will this recovery affect the region?
Well, Brazil, along with the United States and China, is a top trader in the region. So a successful Brazilian economy creates opportunities for other countries, and vice versa. If it's going down, it creates challenges. So the ups and downs, in fact, would be impacting global supply chains, creating spillover effects. But as it continues to open up and look outward, those also create some opportunities for Latin America. For example, as Brazil within Mercosur continues its negotiations with the European Union, and as Mercosur and the Pacific Alliance convergence becomes an increased priority in the region, those might create boosts for different industries, and it might push companies in Brazil and other countries to be more innovative, to be more productive, and to be more efficient.
So fair to say then Brazil could be the driver of economic growth across the region?
In a lot of ways it can be. That is, if it can get its economy back on track. I know it's a slow progress right now, so.
Otaviano, my colleague Rachel Okufo from the Business Show, she recently talked with the president of Brazil's central bank, Ilan Goldfein. Let's listen to part of what he said.
So why do you think we're seeing this surge in confidence in Brazil and its economy?
Well, there was a shift in policy from these excesses that were committed in the past, and you shifted. Also at the central bank, we were quite firm on controlling inflation. Then we were able to reduce interest rates, and that helped the recovery.
When Ilan Goldfein talks about excesses in the past, what's he referring to?
Well, he has in mind the fiscal activism of the previous government. He has in mind the fact that the previous government tried to curb inflation by holding down artificially some regulated price, which left a legacy that the central bank had to deal with when prices were adjusted. Basically, he refers to a clear improvement of policies on both fronts, fiscal, as Thiago aptly remarked, and on the monetary side, as also Ilan is a key part. I would like to add something on a very important point made by Thiago with respect to the corruption and so on. He's fully right when he observed that this is an endemic problem that was there, but what is undeniable is that the incentives vis-a-vis undergoing illicit activities have changed in the country. If using economist language, the rewards adjusted by the risks of undergoing illicit activities vis-a-vis the costs have changed dramatically because the likelihood of being captured has increased and the degree of punishment has also shown to be very drastic, to the point that on the private sector side, there has been in place something that an article at the Financial Times called the Brazilian Corporate Governance Revolution. Now, given the fact that even if you are on the donor side of corrupted relations, you can go to hell, as it has been the case of some leaders. So this changing the structure of incentives. And at the end of the day, there are benefits to be accrued by the Brazilian society and economy, because first of all, the allocation of public resource will tend to be less biased toward corruption opportunities, so the quality of public spending tend to improve. The competition in the private sector will be done through market variables less than political ones. And ultimately, the perception of rule of law in the country will make a difference in the perspective of investors. So there is a positive story that has to be pursued. It's not complete yet, but the signs are good.
Okay, very quickly, Thiago, is Brazil, do you believe, on the way back from corruption, on the way out of corruption, rather?
Yes, I think we are getting near. We're getting near, and we already had seen a lot of improvements.
Right.
This is a very important point that was brought up. There is now fear among the political class, fear among very powerful politicians, and this fear didn't exist before. And where there is fear, there is discipline, there is control. Even if you cannot change the inner point, there is a lot of things that have changed.
Okay, Maria Paula, when we look at Brazil's economy, when we review its performance, etc., Brazil's pension system seems to be at the heart of its budget deficit. President Temer, according to the Reuters news agency, has abandoned efforts to reform that system. And I'm wondering what kind of impact will that have on the economy and politically as well in Brazil?
Well, President Temer didn't manage to approve the pension system reform, which is important for Brazil, so I think it's a negative sign. Let's say the next administration will have to deal with this. Of course, many people say Brazil has left the worst behind because inflation has dropped and now state-controlled firms are considered well managed, but there is still a long way to go, especially in fighting corruption and finding new ways to build a sustainable growth in Brazil. And though severe rulings against powerful have not been common in Brazilian history, we might think that the courts are starting to take a harder line against corruption in Brazil. And to the extent the justice works, it can only be good for Brazil. Of course, the next month will be very important. We have general elections in October to choose a new president, governors for all states and federal districts, and the members of both houses of Congress. At this moment, it's very difficult to predict who is going to win, but we all know that the next president will have to deal with deteriorated fundamentals and have to get structural reforms going. The FMI, as we said in the previous interview, has remade these projections for Brazil. So we are expecting to grow 2.1% in 2019 and 1.9% in the next year.
Right.
However, tried and true economic policies shows that growth in Brazil should be based on higher investments, and the rate of investments in GDP is just 18%, so much lower than in many other BRICS countries. So Brazil still has a long way to go, especially in rooting out patronage, fighting corruption, and all those things.
Okay, Thiago, I want to get back to the pensions issue for a moment. How important an issue politically is it in Brazil? There's an election coming up in October. That's in about 6 months' time. Are we going to hear much more about that?
Probably not, because this is an issue that is highly important for the country. It is already understood by the majority of the candidates, but at the same time is highly unpopular, because it's a necessary change that will, that in the perception of the society will bring short-term prejudices and long-term benefits. So it won't be a major issue discussed during the campaign. It will go silent and probably emerge from this silent period immediately after the campaign to be discussed again.
And Roberta, looking at Brazil's economic relationship with the rest of the world, we look at China. China is now Brazil's biggest trading partner. Chinese investments in Brazil reached a 7-year high in 2017. How important is that relationship?
That relationship has been very important. Chinese investments in Brazil are welcome. They're helping to accelerate the economic growth that we're seeing. China's focus on sectors like electricity, mining, auto, and transportation have really created a long-term strategy of investment for China and helped Brazil get back on its feet. We've seen Chinese companies also controlling an increased part of the electricity transmission and generation sector in Brazil. And beyond that, we're now seeing Chinese companies increasingly investing in the digital economy, the share economy. Companies like 99 Taxis were recently acquired by China, and that really helped Brazil kind of boost its digital economy.
Otaviano, what about the Brazilian economic relationship with the big economy up north, the United States? I mean, you know, we hear from the United States, Donald Trump talking about America first. He just skipped that Summit of the Americas conference that took place in Peru. What does that tell you?
Now, the fact is that the take is very pragmatic on the Brazilian side. There are areas in which Brazil and the U.S. compete. When it comes, for instance, to the production of some agricultural products. Ultimately, the relationship between Brazil and the U.S. will also depend a lot on the relationship between the U.S. and the rest of the world, including China. Hopefully, there will be no open trade wars, because ultimately there are only losers of trade wars. But in the short term, it might even create opportunities for Brazilian-specific products. I think conditions are poised today on the Brazilian side to be more pragmatic with respect to the relation with the U.S., whereas in some moments in the past, it was much led by some sort of an anti-U.S. stance, which is not there. Pragmatism, I believe this is the key word to describe the future of the relationship between Brazil and the U.S.
Thiago, we're hearing a lot about the election that's coming up in Brazil. And I guess a lot of what we're talking about depends on the outcome of that election. Many analysts have been saying that the next leader of Brazil might not come from two of the main parties, which is the Brazilian Social Democracy Party and the Workers' Party, that we could see an outsider come in. Is that likely?
Well, of course we can see an outsider come in. It is too early in the campaign for us to do anything precise and determine what the outcome could be. Just as an example, in 2010, although it was a completely different circumstance, at this time of the year, former President Dilma had 5% of the voting intentions and former Governor Serra had 40%. We already had some virtuous unknown politicians leading the polls 1 year before. So the elections in Brazil, they changed the dynamic immediately after the World Cup. Not because the World Cup captures the attention, this is a myth. But what we can see is that, of course, we can have outsiders in the campaign. This is more likely than in the previous years. But the campaign is a junction of the capability of the candidate as an individual plus his party capability. The two of those things combined make a competitive candidate. If one of those two things is lacking, he depends on the lack of performance of the others instead of his own capability to go all the way.
How important is it for the next leader of Brazil to have the support of Congress, of the Brazilian Congress? Because we know that the Brazilian Congress is made up of a number of disparate parties. He needs the support of Congress, doesn't he, or she?
It's not only important, it's critical. It's life and death. In Latin America, the Brazilian parliament is comparatively way stronger than the executive. And this is something that it was a produce of our 1988 constitution, which created a hybrid between parliamentarism and presidentialism. So historically, we have a president that also elects the larger coalition. So he functions as a prime minister. If we have an outsider that is elected from a small party, and we have the parliament under different coalitions and different compositions, this individual will either be ransomed, hostage to a congressional, to the Congress, or it will be very hard for him to be able to negotiate.
Maria Paula, the election's of course only 6 months away. What, in your view, would be the priority for the new leader once those elections are over?
Well, the priorities will be find a way to create sustainable growth in Brazil. The economist says that Brazil's growth should be based on higher investments and productivity gains. But as I said before, the investment rate in percentage of GDP in Brazil is only 18%, and we don't see any change on that. Of course, also we have 12 million Brazilians with no jobs in Brazil, so the unemployment rate is really something that the new president will have to deal with. And also, people are on the streets. I would say Brazilians are tired of this corruption. So starting in 2011, we had all these marches against corruption going on in Brazil. Those people had no political affiliation. They did not belong to any party, and they didn't recognize a leader. So Brazilians are on the streets by themselves asking for something to change in Brazil. And of course that in the last years, Brazilian government has created institutions to combat regular use of public money in Brazil. So we can see that the government itself is also trying to fight these problems of corruption. And without popular pressure, I think would be little motivation for the executive or legislative branches of power in Brazil really started to tackle corruption.
Roberta, of course, unemployment...
The next month will be really important.
Unemployment as...
So I would say that Lula's conventions let the presidential race in Brazil wide open. At this point, we have no idea who is going to win. But even though he is in jail, serving a 12-year sentence for corruption, he still have 30% of intentions of vote. But also important to say that 30%, one-third of the voters in Brazil say they are disenchanted with the scandals and politics, and they don't want to vote for anyone. So we'll have to see who is going to win all those people.
Okay. Roberta, unemployment, as Maria Paula points out, a big problem in Brazil, but also there's inequality in Brazil. I mean, it's not unique to Brazil. We see this both in developing countries as well as developed countries as well. And as the economy starts to recover, do you see any efforts being made to close this inequality gap?
Efforts have been made. It's hard to say how successful they've been so far, but studies have shown that women play a very important role in the economy. Companies that can integrate women well into their board of directors, into leadership roles, are more lucrative and project more revenue. So I do hope that Brazil can close that gap. It's very high still at this moment, but it's hard to say exactly how they'll do that, and it might depend on the person that is elected. Different candidates have different priorities, of course, and some candidates on the far right and some candidates on the far left have expressed different takes on this. But I think that there is opportunity there, there's opportunity for growth there, and so I hope that they can close that gap.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter @CGTN America. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.